Hello world. You might have noticed that we have no water flowing down the Nile. For the purposes of saving water, we thought it was necessary to keep our hose off for the majority of this video.
In relation to the Osiris shafts, having the water in its drought season and having our hose off completely won't make a difference. You'll see why doing this is important in a second. There is one piece of the puzzle we haven't mentioned in our previous videos, but it is probably as significant as the water stains on the pyramid. People seem to have been ignoring a major anomaly that occurred in ancient Egypt that we want to address.
What happened to Lake Moeris? In its prime, this lake had a circumference of 450 miles and was filled with fresh water to an elevation of 82 feet above sea level, described as an integral part of ancient Egypt. Mysteriously, it became a much smaller saltwater lake known as Lake Karun. The biggest question about ancient Egypt should be, how did Lake Moeris convert into salt water, and what impact would that have had 5,000 years ago?
Today, there is water in the Osiris shafts, similar to the water in Lake Moeris. Both are described as saltier than the Nile, but less salty than the Mediterranean, kind of a combination of both waters. To see how this is possible, we're going to conduct an experiment. Think back a couple of videos ago when we showed you an Osiris shaft that extended to the Mediterranean that the Egyptians blocked off. Either this blocked off connection was slowly eroded away, or a natural occurrence created a fissure. Either way, an opening between the Osiris shaft and the Mediterranean Sea was open below sea level.
We believe this opening would have allowed the heavier salt water of the Mediterranean to enter their tunnels and replace the lighter fresh water. So the experiment we're planning on doing in this video is to see if salt water would travel into the Osiris shafts if they were already full of fresh water.
To do this, we're going to use red-dyed water in our Mediterranean Sea and watch to see if it overtakes our Osiris shafts.
My son is going to open the ball valve to simulate a leak in their system. Then we will start our second camera to time-lapse this process. To be completely accurate to what we just described, we should only crack the ball valve open just a little bit to symbolize a small leak in their system. But because our Osiris shafts are the size of a nickel, proportionally, a fissure would be the size of a pinhead.
Doing this would take months, but because this concept would be the same no matter how large the opening is, to speed things up, we just open the ball valve all the way. Finally, we placed a clock on the screen so you can see how long of a time passes during this time lapse. Okay, as you can see, only about 20 minutes or so has passed, but we wanted to come in and point something out while it's happening. Notice how the heavier salt water and lighter fresh water are both moving simultaneously through our pipes without mixing. We wanted to point this out while it's happening.
This is because salt water and fresh water act like oil and water when they first connect. Keep this in mind as we describe the phenomenon in Lake Moeris later in our video. Okay, now that the Osiris shafts have been completely overtaken by salt water, I turned the flood season on so you can watch what happens. My son is also going to close the ball valve to a small crack simulating the leak we talked about earlier about the Mediterranean.
As water begins filling the Osiris shafts, some of the water will leak back into the Mediterranean, but the majority of it will flow through their system and rise up 82 feet to flow back into Lake Moeris. For the next several flood seasons, this same phenomenon would repeat itself. For the first couple days, only salt water would flow through their system. Then when the fresh water finished purging all of the salt water, the system would function as normal.
Each flood season, this small amount of salt water wouldn't cause alarm. It mostly settled to the bottom of the lake. The freshwater fish would still continue to live just closer to the surface. After several flood seasons, salt water would completely overtake the lake. At that point, all fish in the lake would suddenly and without warning die. Anybody living near the lake would have to either move or die from lack of food and water.
We don't want to conduct this experiment 5 to 7 more times to turn our lake completely red and salty. And because we just proved that salt water could have risen above sea level to contaminate Lake Moeris, we're going to drop some extra dye in our lake to simulate several years of this occurring. And we're also going to turn our Nile back to the drought season.
They can see that's pink, yeah.
Yeah.
Once this
Turn the
happened,
Nile to drought season.
and the flood season ended, they would have reversed their system to drain Lake Moeris. For 8 months, bloody salt water would have flowed down the Nile, soaking into the delta, destroying their economy forever. The dead fish probably caused insect infestations and other anomalies to occur.
People would have had no choice but to drink this contaminated water, and as a result, they got sick and even broke out with boils, much like ancient stories suggest, including the Ipuwer papyrus, now in the Leiden Museum in Holland.
People living in the area would have been left with 2 options: remain and die, or run for their lives.
We believe most people chose the latter, and abandoning their system would have extended the artificial drought we talked about in a previous video for decades. Eventually, as more flood seasons came, the Osiris shafts would have clogged with debris and sand, and the Nile from Aswan down to the Mediterranean would have experienced flood seasons once again.
We believe this catastrophe caused the collapse of the old kingdom of ancient Egypt, and was also the reason for the Nile's extended drought only experienced in Egypt.
By now, you should know and understand why the Egyptians created the Osiris shafts, the Sphinx, and the Great Pyramid.
If you want more detail about our theory, we recommend you watch our other series. It explains everything in much more detail and provides much more evidence and information. Or, as always, you can post a comment or email us, and we'll be happy to get back to you.
Thank you.